It's Friday, December 27th, 2024. Welcome to your new backcountry snowpack summary brought to you by North Shore Rescue. We had a pretty decent storm on Christmas Day. Depending where you were, maybe something between 30 and 50 centimeters of new snow fell with pretty strong winds. And just like that, I guess the North Shore avalanche season started. On Boxing Days, local ski hills started to do a little bit of avalanche control, got a little bit of activity, triggered mostly with explosives on Boxing Day. And now things are settling quite nicely. Now, if you ski or snowshoe in the backcountry, you probably have your little routine at this time of the week where you're preparing for the weekend, looking at weather forecasts for a while, and then moving on to the avalanche bulletin and see how the weather is going to affect the snow stability. And you may have noticed that it looks like we're having a pretty solid storm coming tonight and tomorrow. Depending on the models, are talking about 30 to 50 millimeters of precipitation. And with that, we have rising freezing level and strong winds. So that's like three big red flags. And then as you move on to the avalanche bulletin this morning anyways, it only goes to considerable. To understand why high precip, high winds, and rising freezing level doesn't push us into the high category, we have to understand a little bit and take a dive into the nuts and bolts of avalanche hazard evaluation. Avalanche forecasters have to work with a tool which is the avalanche hazard scale. To understand avalanche hazard, we really have to read those definitions and really understand what is moderate and what is considerable. Now, when we evaluate avalanche hazard, we use the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, which looks like this. So we identify a problem. Let's say, for example, that we pick persistent slab because we have a layer of surface hoar that is buried at tree line. So we have our avalanche problem, and we also have the location. Now we have to establish the likelihood of triggering an avalanche on that layer. And if we do trigger an avalanche, how big is it going to be? So let's imagine here that we have this layer of surface hoar and it's buried 50 centimeters down. But as it was forming, we had a dry period. So we had surface hoar growing at night. And then during the day, it was nice and sunny. So on the solar aspect, it melted. And then we had a little bit of north wind, which essentially scoured the surface hoar from all the north aspects. But at tree line, if you managed to find like a sheltered area that was protected by a tree island from the north wind and didn't really see the sun, then the surface hoar has been preserved. But that surface hoar is only in isolated little pockets. So that's the spatial distribution part of the likelihood of avalanche. The second part is the sensitivity to triggering. So in this case, we presume that if we have surface hoar buried by 50 centimeters of new snow, it would be fairly easy to trigger. It would be very reactive, even maybe a little bit touchy. So now if we do the exercise of putting a monkey on a snowmobile with a full tank of gas and letting that monkey roam free around tree line, how likely is it that he's going to trigger an avalanche? Now, if he hits a pocket, it's quite likely that he'll trigger an avalanche. But on the other hand, those pockets are isolated, so the likelihood that he'll actually come across one is maybe not that high. So the likelihood of triggering doesn't mean that there isn't a layer that's ready to go. In this case, it just means that, yeah, there is, but it's only in very isolated spots. But if you find one of those spots, it will probably reliably go. Now, the second part of that equation is the size of the avalanche. And since we're dealing here with maybe 50 centimeters of snow is quite a sizable crown. It's certainly enough to trigger a large avalanche. Large meaning size 2, something that's big enough to bury somebody. But because they're isolated pockets, it's unlikely that it's going to propagate really, really wide and then create a very large, like a size 3 or a size 4. Right. So if you look into the definition of what moderate hazard is, then you have, you know, large avalanches in isolated area, and that seems to fit perfectly that scenario. So now if we take these concepts and apply them to the coming storm and the state of the terrain and snowpack at the moment, most of the North Shore is still below threshold, which means that the ground roughness is still very much present. In order to get an avalanche, you need to have a smooth slope with a bed surface for the avalanche to slide on. And there's just not a whole lot of places on the North Shore that are filled in enough to produce avalanches. So then you end up having, even if you have, you know, the perfect combination of high precipitation, high winds, and rising freezing levels, which would certainly probably lead to some natural avalanche activity. The reality is there's only isolated places where it can happen at this time, just because we don't have enough snow on the ground yet. Same thing with the size of avalanches. Large avalanches usually happen a little bit later when those pockets, those start zones, start to connect. Right now, all of the slopes that can really slide or produce avalanche, for the most part, are fairly small. But there are certainly slopes at threshold, and in some cases, some fairly large slopes at threshold. They're just very isolated for the time being. As always, early in the season, we also have to be mindful for the severity of terrain traps, so small avalanches taking you through deadfalls and rocks and open creeks. So like I said earlier, we did get a fair bit of snow for Christmas. So if you want to know a little bit more about the snowpack and what it means for the weekend and the storm that's coming, stick around for the snowpack discussion. We're at 1,200 meters on a west aspect. We dug pretty much all the way to ground. The ground is immediately underneath here. So we have actually a snowpack of about 125 centimeters, which is essentially double what we had from before Christmas. It's still very easy to tell where the old surface was. Underneath here, we still have these big wet grains that were forming the snowpack before Christmas. The storm of Christmas Day left 30 to 50 centimeters, depending where you were, accompanied by strong southeasterly, easterly winds. So here on the west aspect, we are in a sort of preferential deposition area, so we'd expect to have a little bit on the higher end of that spectrum. Here I measured like 33 centimeters, which is maybe a little bit less than I expected. However, it is typical like coastal glue, so it probably has settled a fair bit. Right at the tail end of the storm, it got warm and it rained for a brief period up to mountaintop. So we have this breakable crust that formed right here. And on top of that, we have roughly 10 centimeters of new snow that fell on Boxing Day. Now the new snow is settling very nicely. You can still find some density change within the storm snow of Christmas Day. And there's of course the interface here between the old snow and that new storm snow. But right now everything seems to be settling really quite nicely. There's no real big things that stand out. There was a little bit of avalanche activity that happened on Boxing Day, either within the storm snow, or we could see shooting cracks going all the way down to that interface down here. But overall, I think it's just following its normal sort of North Shore, very rapid settling pattern. So tonight and tomorrow, we're expecting another storm to move in with a fair bit of precipitation, still some fairly strong winds, some rising freezing levels as well. So no big concern down here, but it remains to be seen exactly what's going to happen to the new snow and how much of that is going to be snow rather than rain. It's still very much low tide out there, not quite enough snow just yet to really ski in the backcountry. For snowshoers, again, just be mindful of early season condition and also terrain trap hazards that are much more significant at this time of year. That's all I got for this week. Happy New Year, everybody, and we'll see you soon.